Growing up on the south side of Chicago wasn't easy. The neighborhood had more broken dreams than working streetlights, but Andrew had something special burning inside him. His mama worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table and the lights on. Between shifts at the hospital, the convenience store, and weekend house cleaning, she still found time to take her boy to free community plays whenever she could. Andrew would sit in those worn-out theater seats with wide eyes, forgetting about the cold apartment waiting for them, the homework piled up, and the empty fridge. On that small stage, he saw people become someone else entirely. They could be kings, heroes, or anyone they wanted. That's when he knew what he wanted. You watch too many movies, his friends would laugh when he talked about becoming an actor. But Andrew kept at it. He joined every school play, even when the other boys called him names. By senior year, his drama teacher pulled him aside. "You've got something real," she told him. "Don't waste it." After high school, Andrew worked at the grocery store during the day and took night classes at the community center. He saved every penny. His mama would slip extra dollars into his savings jar when she thought he wasn't looking. 3 years of double shifts, no new clothes, no going out, just work and dreams. The day he bought his one-way bus ticket to Los Angeles, half the neighborhood came to say goodbye. His mama held him tight, pressed her savings into his hand. "Don't come back until you're on the big screen," she whispered, trying to hide her tears. Los Angeles wasn't waiting with open arms. The city chewed up dreamers like bubble gum. Andrew slept on a cousin's couch for 6 months, then shared an apartment with 4 other struggling actors. He worked as a waiter, a parking attendant, a dog walker, anything to pay for acting classes and make rent. For 5 years, all he got were commercials and background work. Standing in crowd scenes, saying one line in TV shows that got cancelled, playing robbery victim number 3 in police dramas. But Andrew kept showing up. Every rejection just made him work harder. "You're too intense," one casting director told him. "Too urban," said another, which Andrew knew was code for something else. His big moment came when his acting coach invited a few industry people to their showcase. Andrew performed a scene he'd written himself about his grandfather who'd worked the same factory job for 40 years without complaining once. The raw emotion in his performance silenced the room. A week later, an indie filmmaker called. She was making a small movie about family struggles in urban America and had no budget to speak of. Andrew didn't care about money, he cared about the role. For 6 weeks, they shot in crowded apartments and on street corners, working around everyone's day jobs. When the film made it to Sundance, nobody expected much. It was too small, too honest, too lacking in special effects or famous names. But sometimes, truth cuts deeper than fiction. After the screening, people couldn't stop talking about the unknown actor who delivered a performance so real it felt like documentary footage. Critics wrote about the discovery of the year. Talent agents who had ignored his calls suddenly couldn't wait to meet him. Directors who made the kind of films that won awards started mentioning his name in interviews. At 28, after years of being invisible, Andrew found himself seen, really seen. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. His mama called every day, reading him reviews from the Chicago newspapers. The neighborhood convenience store where she worked put up a sign, "Home of Andrew's mom." He was still living in that cramped apartment with the leaky ceiling and 4 roommates when the call came. One of Hollywood's most powerful directors wanted to meet him. The kind of director who made careers with a single film. The kind whose movies were events, not just entertainment. Andrew couldn't sleep the night before. This wasn't just another audition. This was the door he'd been pushing against for years finally starting to open. Andrew sat in the waiting room of the fancy building on Sunset Boulevard, his hands sweating. The chairs were real leather, not the cracked plastic he was used to. Pictures of movie stars lined the walls, all people who had worked with Richard Hampton, the famous director waiting behind those heavy wooden doors. Everyone in Hollywood knew about Hampton. He'd won 3 Academy Awards and had the power to make or break careers with a single phone call. His films weren't just movies, they were events. Critics called him a genius. Actors would cut their pay just to work with him. "He'll see you now," said the assistant, not even looking up from her computer. Andrew wiped his sweaty palms on his pants before walking in. The office was bigger than his entire apartment. Hampton sat behind a desk that could have been in a museum, papers spread out everywhere. "So you're the guy everyone's talking about," Hampton said, not getting up. His eyes were sharp, like he could see right through people. The kid from the indie film. Yes, sir, Andrew said, trying to keep his voice steady. He'd practiced what to say all night, but now his mind went blank. Hampton pointed to a chair. Sit. Tell me why I should cast you in the biggest film of my career when nobody knows who you are. Andrew took a deep breath. He could lie, try to sound important, drop names of people he barely knew. But instead, he decided to be honest. I don't have connections or a fancy acting school degree, he said. What I have is life experience. I've seen things, felt things. I know what it's like to be invisible, to fight for respect. That's exactly what your main character goes through. Hampton didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't give any sign that he was impressed or interested. He just stared at Andrew for a long minute. Read this, he finally said, sliding over a few pages of script. The scene where he discovers the truth. Andrew hadn't prepared for this. He scanned the pages quickly, then closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about his mom working those 3 jobs. He thought about all the doors that had closed in his face. Then he looked up and wasn't Andrew anymore. He was the character, a man whose whole world was crushing down around him. When he finished, the room was silent. Hampton's face was still hard to read, but something had changed in his eyes. The studio wants me to cast Tyler Reed, Hampton said, mentioning a famous actor everyone knew. He's safe, predictable, will sell tickets. Andrew's heart sank. Of course, this meeting was just for show. But Tyler can't do what you just did, Hampton continued. He's never been hungry, never had to fight. It shows. He leaned forward. I'm offering you the role. Don't make me regret it. Just like that, Andrew's life changed forever. The movie was called Shadows of Intent, a psychological thriller about a man discovering dark secrets in his own past. The budget was huge. The pressure was even bigger. The first day on set, Andrew showed up 2 hours early. The trailer with his name on it was bigger than any place he'd ever lived. Inside was a handwritten note from Hampton, "Don't mess this up." Filming was harder than anything Andrew had ever done. Hampton demanded perfection. Some days they shot the same scene 30 times. Andrew would collapse into bed each night, completely drained, only to wake up and do it all again. Again, Hampton would shout after Andrew poured his heart into a scene. I don't believe you. Make me believe you. But the hard work paid off. When the film premiered at the Chinese Theater in Hollywood, Andrew brought his mama as his date. She wore a dress they'd saved 3 months to buy and cried when she saw her son's name on the movie poster. Critics called the film a masterpiece. They called Andrew a revelation, a new kind of star. Where has this actor been hiding? Wrote one. A performance that will be studied in acting schools for years, wrote another. Overnight, everything changed. People recognized Andrew on the street. Directors who had ignored his audition tapes were suddenly calling his agent. He moved his mama to a nice house in a good neighborhood. He bought himself a car that actually started every time. At the big award shows that season, Andrew sat in the front rows, next to actors he'd grown up watching on TV. Hampton's film won prize after prize. When Andrew won Best Newcomer at the Critics' Choice Awards, he thanked his mama first, then Hampton. Thank you for taking a chance on an unknown actor, he said, looking at Hampton in the audience. Thank you for pushing me harder than I've ever been pushed. Hampton nodded slightly, his expression still impossible to read. Nobody knew that behind the scenes, things between them were already starting to crack. The red carpet smiles hid what was really happening. While cameras flashed and fans screamed, the relationship between Andrew and director Richard Hampton was falling apart behind closed doors. It started with small things. Hampton would criticize Andrew in front of the whole crew. Did you even read the script? He'd ask loudly when Andrew tried a different approach to a scene. Maybe I should have cast someone who understands the character. The other actors would look away, embarrassed. Nobody stood up for Andrew because nobody wanted to be Hampton's next target. At first, Andrew told himself this was just how great directors worked. He'd heard stories about geniuses being difficult. Maybe this was the price of making something special. But as weeks passed, he noticed something strange. Hampton seemed harder on him than anyone else. The breaking point came during the night shoot of the movie's most emotional scene. Andrew had prepared for weeks. The scene required him to break down after discovering a terrible truth about his character's past. They'd been filming for 16 hours straight, and everyone was exhausted. After the first take, Hampton walked onto the set shaking his head. "That's what you call acting. My nephew could do better in his school play." Andrew took a deep breath. "I'm trying something different, if you'd let me explain." "I don't need explanations from you," Hampton cut him off. "Just do your job. Some of us actually earned our place in this industry instead of just getting lucky." The set went silent. Even the crew members who usually kept their heads down looked uncomfortable. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Andrew asked quietly. Hampton stepped closer. "You know exactly what I mean. You think you're here because of talent? You're here because I needed someone who looked the part. You're here because I took a chance on you when nobody else would. Don't forget that." The words hung in the air. Andrew felt his face burn as everyone watched. He wanted to walk off set, but he knew what that would mean for his career. Instead, he swallowed his pride and did the scene again. And again. And again. Hampton made him repeat it 17 times before finally moving on. That night, Andrew called his mama. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," he told her. "Baby, that man sees you as a threat," she said. "You're too good, and he knows it. Don't let him break you." The next day, Andrew tried talking to Hampton privately. "I feel like there's something personal in how you're treating me," he said carefully. "If I've done something wrong." Hampton laughed. "Personal? Don't flatter yourself. I'm trying to save my movie from your amateur performance. This isn't some little indie film where you can get by on being authentic. This is the big leagues." When Andrew suggested that some of Hampton's criticism seemed focused on things beyond his acting, the director's face changed. "Careful," Hampton warned. "Very careful. Lots of actors would kill for your position. Lots of actors are much easier to work with. Remember that." The message was clear. The movie wrapped and the publicity tour began. In interviews, Hampton was all smiles, taking credit for discovering Andrew. "I saw potential and shaped it," he would say, patting Andrew's shoulder too hard. "Raw talent needs guidance." Andrew played along, smiling for cameras and thanking Hampton for the opportunity. What choice did he have? But something had broken between them. After the award season ended, Andrew expected offers to pour in. His performance had been praised everywhere. But strangely, the big roles he was perfect for went to other actors. Projects he was attached to suddenly went in another direction. His agent couldn't get straight answers from casting directors. Then he heard rumors. At a party, a producer had too much to drink and let slip. "Hampton says you're impossible to work with. Says you don't take direction and have an attitude problem." Andrew was stunned. While Hampton smiled to his face, he'd been destroying his reputation behind his back. At exclusive industry dinners Andrew wasn't invited to, in meetings with studio heads, Hampton had been calling him difficult, unprofessional, not worth the headache. "He's talented but thinks he knows better than everyone else," Hampton told people. "Constantly questioning my direction, always showing up late." None of it was true, but it didn't matter. Hampton's word was gold in Hollywood. When Andrew tried to defend himself, people saw it as proving Hampton's point. "See how defensive he gets," they'd say. Classic difficult actor behavior. His agent started avoiding his calls. Friends in the industry suddenly became too busy to meet. Slowly, Andrew realized the terrible truth. In an industry built on relationships and reputations, Hampton had the power to make or break careers. And he had chosen to break Andrew's. The question that kept Andrew awake at night was simple: why? Was it because he had dared to question Hampton's methods? Or was it something deeper, something about seeing a young black actor receive praise Hampton thought should be directed at the director? Whatever the reason, the result was the same. The doors that had briefly opened were now closing, one by one. 2 years can change everything. Andrew sat in a coffee shop, checking his phone again. No calls, no messages, just the same empty screen he'd been staring at for months. The barista recognized him and gave him a sad smile. "Weren't you in that movie? The one with all the awards?" Andrew nodded and looked away. Being recognized was now more painful than flattering. After that blow-up with Hampton on set, things had gotten worse in ways Andrew never imagined possible. He'd gone from red carpets to rejection, from magazine covers to being ghosted by his own agent. Look, I gotta be honest with you, his agent had finally told him during their last meeting. Nobody wants to touch you right now. Hampton's got friends everywhere, and word is spread that you're trouble. But it's not true, Andra had protested. You know it's not true. I've never been late to set, never caused problems. His agent had just shrugged. Truth doesn't matter in this town. Perception does. And the perception is that you're difficult. The next week, his agent stopped returning his calls altogether. Andra tried reaching out directly to directors he'd met during the award season. People who had praised his work and promised future collaborations. Their assistants all gave the same response. They'll get back to you. None ever did. The money from Shadows of Intent started running out. Andra had bought his mama a nice house, had helped cousins with college tuition, had donated to the community center back home. He'd never imagined the well would dry up so quickly. His mama called every day. Baby, maybe it's time to come home for a while. Regroup. But going home felt like admitting defeat, so Andra kept trying. He started going to open casting calls again, standing in long lines with hundreds of hopefuls, just like when he first arrived in LA. Casting directors would do double takes when they saw him. Aren't you, weren't you? Yes, that's me, he'd say, trying to sound confident. What happened? They'd ask, not unkindly. What could he say? That the most powerful director in Hollywood had decided to destroy him? It sounded paranoid, even though it was true. Andra's lowest point came when he auditioned for a small role in a TV crime show, the kind of part he would have turned down 2 years earlier. The casting director had been excited to see him, but the next day she called with a strange tone in her voice. I'm so sorry, she said. They loved you, but then someone from above stepped in. I don't know what's going on, but it feels like someone's blocking you. That night, Andra sat on his apartment balcony looking out at the city lights. His fancy apartment with the view he'd been so proud of, he'd have to give it up soon. The rent was due, and his bank account was nearly empty. His phone buzzed with a text from a former co-star. Just heard Hampton's new movie is casting. Lead role went to David Powell. Wasn't that the part you were up for? Andra hadn't even gotten an audition for that film, even though the character was written as a man in his late 20s with his exact background. The next morning, Andra woke up to an email from his landlord reminding him about the overdue rent. He opened his laptop and looked at flights to Chicago. Maybe his mama was right. Maybe it was time to go home, at least for a while. As he packed up his apartment, memories flooded back. The day he'd moved in, riding the elevator with his keys, feeling like he'd finally made it. The housewarming party where industry people had shown up with expensive gifts and promises of collaboration. The view of the Hollywood sign that had once felt like a daily reminder of his success. Now it all felt like a cruel joke. The hardest call was to his mama. I'm coming home, he finally admitted. Just for a bit, until things turn around. Your room is waiting for you, she said, and he could hear both love and heartbreak in her voice. She'd been so proud of him. Everyone back home had. Andra gave away most of his furniture, sold his car at a loss, and packed the rest of his life into 2 suitcases. As the plane took off from LAX, he looked down at the sprawling city that had first welcomed him with dreams, then chewed him up and spit him out. Back in Chicago, nothing and everything had changed. His old neighborhood looked smaller somehow. His mama's new house, the one he'd bought her, felt both comforting and like a reminder of his failure. Neighbors and old friends stopped by, trying to hide their curiosity behind casseroles and questions about celebrities. You'll bounce back, they assured him. Hollywood's loss is our gain. Maybe you could teach acting at the community center. At night, Andra would lie awake in his childhood bedroom, surrounded by his old posters and trophies from school plays. How had it gone so wrong? One man's vendetta had erased years of hard work, talent, and determination. The industry magazines still came to his mama's house. He couldn't help reading them, torturing himself with news about projects he should have been considered for. Hampton's face appeared regularly, always described as visionary and genius. No mention of how he treated people, how he played favorites, how he destroyed careers on a whim. 6 months after returning to Chicago, Andra hit rock bottom. His savings were gone. His mama never mentioned the money he'd started borrowing from her retirement fund. He took a job tending bar at a local spot where people sometimes recognized him and asked for selfies. "What happened to you, man?" They'd ask after a few drinks. You were supposed to be the next big thing. Andrew just smiled and mixed their drinks. What could he possibly say? Winter in Chicago hit hard. Andrew walked home from his bartending shift, the cold wind biting through his jacket. 6 months back in his hometown, and the sting of failure hadn't eased up one bit. Each day felt the same. Wake up, avoid looking at his old movie posters, work the bar, come home, repeat. Sometimes he'd catch his mama looking at him with worry in her eyes. That hurt worse than anything Hampton had done. One night, a group of film students came into the bar. They recognized Andrew immediately, eyes going wide. "No way. We just studied your work in class last week," one of them said. "Our professor uses that breakdown scene as an example of perfect acting technique." Andrew smiled politely, used to these encounters by now. But as he mixed their drinks, he overheard them talking about their student film project, complaining about equipment problems, and how hard it was to get decent footage with their cheap cameras. "What kind of camera are you using?" Andrew found himself asking. Soon they were deep in conversation. The students were passionate but struggling with basic filmmaking challenges. Andrew surprised himself by how much he'd picked up just from watching directors and cinematographers work. "You know way more than we do," one student said. "You should make your own stuff." Andrew laughed it off, but that night he couldn't sleep. The idea kept bouncing around in his head. Make his own stuff. He wasn't a filmmaker. But then again, what did he have to lose? The next morning, he opened his laptop and Googled how to make an independent film. The search returned millions of results. Andrew started reading, and for the first time in months, hours flew by without him checking the time. He called one of the students from the bar and asked more questions. Then he dug into his closet and pulled out a box he'd been avoiding, awards and memorabilia from Shadows of Intent. At the bottom was an envelope containing his last big check, the one he'd been saving for emergencies. This felt like an emergency of the soul. Andrew bought a decent camera, some basic sound equipment, and a laptop that could handle video editing software. His mama watched him unpack it all with a mixture of concern and hope. "What exactly are you planning?" she asked. "I'm not sure yet," Andrew admitted, "but I need to create something or I'm gonna lose my mind." He started small, filming everyday scenes around his neighborhood, kids playing basketball, old folks sitting on stoops, the changing seasons. He interviewed his barber, who'd been cutting hair on the same corner for 40 years. He filmed the ladies at his mama's church who ran the food bank. Something about being behind the camera felt right. Late at night, Andrew began writing. Not just anything, but his story, a screenplay about a young black actor's journey through Hollywood. Not a pity party, but an honest look at how the system worked, who held power, and how easily careers could be made or broken. He changed names and details, but the heart of it was his experience. The first time he shared pages with one of the film students, he was terrified. "This is incredible," the student said after reading. "It's real in a way most Hollywood stuff isn't." Andrew kept writing, kept filming practice scenes. He took online courses in screenwriting and directing. He tracked down local actors who had moved back from LA or New York, people with talent who hadn't gotten the right breaks. "I can't pay much," he told them honestly, "but this story needs to be told." To his surprise, they signed on immediately. Word spread in Chicago's small film community. A cinematographer who'd shot commercials offered to help. A local musician wanted to do the score. People showed up with equipment, props, food for the crew. Andrew's bartending boss let them use the bar after hours for scenes. The community center opened their doors. Neighbors offered their homes as locations. His old drama teacher from high school came out of retirement to help with the actors. "You always had something special," she reminded him. "Not just in front of the camera." Filming was chaotic. Andrew had to learn everything on the fly: where to put the camera, how to direct actors, how to manage a set. They filmed on weekends and nights, working around everyone's day jobs. Some days nothing went right. Equipment failed. Weather didn't cooperate. Scenes had to be reshot. "Maybe this is crazy," Andrew told his mama one night after a particularly tough shoot. "Maybe I'm just wasting everyone's time." She took his face in her hands like she used to when he was small. "Baby, I've watched you these past months. When you were tending bar, your eyes were dead. Now they're alive again. That's not a waste. The next day, they nailed a crucial scene, one where the main character confronts a director character based loosely on Hampton. The actor playing the director had studied Hampton's interviews and captured his mannerisms perfectly. Watching the footage that night, Andra felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just therapy anymore. This was something real. After 6 months of shooting, Andra had a rough cut of the film. He called it industry standards. It wasn't perfect. The budget constraints showed in places, but the story was honest and raw in a way big studio films rarely were. What now? His mama asked when he showed her the finished film in their living room. Andra took a deep breath. Now we see if anyone else wants to hear this story. He submitted the film to every festival he could afford the entry fee for, starting with the Chicago International Film Festival. Most would reject it, he knew that. But maybe, just maybe, one would give him a chance. Not as an actor this time, but as a storyteller with something important to say. While waiting for responses, Andra kept working at the bar. He wouldn't let himself hope too much. Hollywood had taught him that lesson the hard way. But something had changed. When people asked the familiar question, "What happened to you?" he now had an answer. "I'm making my own way," he'd say. And for the first time since coming home, he actually believed it. The email arrived at 2:17 a.m. Andra was just getting home from his late shift at the bar, feet aching, smelling of beer and French fries. He almost didn't check his phone. Almost. "Congratulations," the message began. "Your film, Industry Standards, has been selected for the Chicago International Film Festival." Andra read it 3 times to make sure he wasn't dreaming. Then he ran upstairs and woke his mama, who came to the door in her robe, alarmed. "What's wrong? What happened?" "They accepted it," Andra said, his voice shaking. "They're going to show my movie at the festival." She hugged him so tight he could barely breathe. "I knew it," she whispered. "I always knew." The following weeks were a blur. Andra had to finish the sound mix, create a poster, prepare press materials, all things he'd never done before. His film student friends stepped in to help. His bartending boss gave him time off. The local actors who'd worked for almost nothing were over the moon. "We're all going to dress up," one of them said. "Make it a real red carpet, even if we have to roll out the carpet ourselves." The night of the screening, Andra stood in the back of the theater, too nervous to sit. The venue wasn't huge, nothing like the massive premieres he'd attended for Shadows of Intent, but every seat was filled. Local press, film students, friends, family, neighbors from his old block, even his high school teachers had shown up. As the lights dimmed, Andra held his breath. This wasn't just a movie. This was his response to everything that had happened, his statement to the world and to himself. The film told the story of a young black actor who gets his big break, only to be systematically undermined by a powerful director who sees him as a threat. While Andra had changed enough details to avoid legal problems, anyone in the industry would recognize the Hampton-like character with his fake smile and brutal methods. But the film wasn't just about exposing one bad director. It dug into the whole system, how Hollywood talked about diversity while keeping tight control over who actually got power, how careers depended on relationships more than talent, how easy it was to be erased if you stepped out of line. When the credits rolled, the theater was silent for a moment. Then someone started clapping. Others joined in. Soon the whole place was on its feet. Andra's mama grabbed his hand, tears streaming down her face. The Q&A session afterward lasted twice as long as scheduled. People had so many questions, not just about the filmmaking, but about the truth behind the story. "Is this really how Hollywood works?" a young film student asked. "Parts of it are better, parts are worse," Andra answered honestly. "But yes, power works like this in many industries. Some people build others up. Some people destroy what they fear." A local reporter raised her hand. "Were you afraid to tell this story? Aren't you worried about backlash?" Andra thought about it. "I was more afraid of not telling it, of letting someone else define who I am and what happened." The festival buzz grew louder each day. Other filmmakers sought Andra out, wanting to talk about his techniques, his story. Industry Standards won the Audience Award, voted on by regular viewers, not critics or judges. A reviewer from an independent film website wrote, The raw honesty of this film feels like a splash of cold water in an industry built on illusion. The unnamed director at its center will be recognizable to insiders, and his portrayal is devastating without ever becoming a caricature. The article was shared thousands of times online. Other film festivals began reaching out, wanting to screen industry standards. Andrew could hardly keep up with the emails. Then came the call that changed everything. A representative from StreamNow, one of the biggest streaming platforms, wanted to meet about acquiring his film. "They're offering how much?" his mama asked when he told her, sitting down suddenly as if her legs had given out. The number was higher than Andrew had earned for his role in Hampton's blockbuster. But more important than the money was the platform, millions of viewers worldwide. "We love that your film doesn't just point fingers," the StreamNow executive told him. "It shows how the system works and asks for better. That's the kind of storytelling we want to support." There was one moment of hesitation. The contract included doing press for the film, interviews, panels, podcasts, putting himself out there again, telling his story again and again. "What if they don't believe me?" Andrew asked his mama. "What if Hampton's friends come after me?" She looked him straight in the eyes. "Baby, the truth always comes out eventually. Always, you just gotta be brave enough to tell it." The day industry standards dropped on StreamNow, Andrew couldn't bring himself to look at social media or reviews. Instead, he took his mama to the community theater where he'd first fallen in love with acting as a child. They sat in the back row, talking about how far he'd come. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing in his pocket. Finally, he checked it. Messages poured in from old friends, from actors he'd worked with, from strangers who'd just watched his film. But one text made him freeze. It was from his old co-star on Hampton's movie. "Just finished your film. You told the truth. I've been afraid to speak up, but I'm not anymore. Call me." Within days, similar messages arrived. Crew members, other actors, people who had worked with Hampton and experienced similar treatment but had been too afraid to say anything. Andrew's film had opened a door, and people were walking through it. A major industry publication contacted him about doing a feature story. Not about his failed acting career or his comeback as a filmmaker, but about the system his film exposed and the real-life director whose behavior had inspired it. "Are you ready for this?" the journalist asked him. "Once this story runs, there's no going back." Andrew thought about the scared young man he'd been, believing one powerful person could end his dreams. He wasn't that person anymore. "I'm ready," he said. "Let's tell the truth." Andrew stood on the balcony of his hotel room, looking out at the LA skyline. 40 years ago, he'd left this city broken and defeated. Now he was back, but everything was different. The magazine article had dropped like a bomb in Hollywood. "Exposed. The dark side of a directing legend," read the headline. Andrew's story formed the backbone, but he wasn't alone anymore. 20 other people had come forward, actors, crew members, assistants, all sharing similar experiences with Richard Hampton. "He made me reshoot a scene 43 times, then told everyone I was incompetent," said a respected actress. "He threatened to ruin my career when I questioned his treatment of a young black actor," said a veteran cinematographer. "He had different rules for different people. If he liked you, you could do no wrong. If he didn't, nothing you did was ever good enough," said a producer. The stories painted a clear picture of a man who used his power to build up certain people while tearing down others, especially people of color who he seemed to view as threats rather than talents to nurture. Hampton's response came quick, disappointed that failed actors are trying to blame their shortcomings on me. "I've always supported diverse talent. These accusations are simply false." But this time, nobody was buying it. Too many respected industry voices had spoken up. Too many patterns had emerged. The evidence was overwhelming. Studios began quietly distancing themselves from Hampton. Projects he was attached to announced scheduling conflicts and found new directors. Award nominations that had seemed guarantees suddenly went to others. The same whisper network that had once worked against Andrew was now working against Hampton. Meanwhile, Andrew's life had transformed in ways he could never have imagined. Industry Standards became one of StreamNow's most watched films of the year. Critics called it brave, necessary, and the film Hollywood needed. Film schools added it to their curriculum. His phone, once silent for months, now wouldn't stop ringing. But these weren't calls for acting jobs. These were offers to direct, to produce, to help create a more equitable industry. With the money from StreamNow, Andrew started his own production company called Second Chance Films. His mission was simple: create opportunities for talented people who had been overlooked or pushed out of the industry. "I'm looking for people with stories to tell who haven't had the platform," he explained in interviews, "especially those who've been told they don't belong." His first hire was the cinematographer from his Chicago crew. His second was an actress who'd been blacklisted after reporting harassment by a famous producer. Together, they began developing a slate of projects that major studios were suddenly very interested in financing. The ultimate irony came 6 months after the expose. Andrew was having lunch with his mama at a restaurant in Beverly Hills. She was visiting LA for the first time since his big premiere years ago, when his phone buzzed with a text from his new agent. "Urgent, call me now." Andrew stepped outside to make the call. "You're not going to believe this," his agent said. "Remember that big studio project Hampton was supposed to direct? The one about the civil rights movement? Well, Hampton's officially out, and they want you to direct it." Andrew nearly dropped his phone. This wasn't just any project. This was the prestige film everyone in town had been talking about, the kind of project that won awards and made careers. "Why me?" Andrew asked. "I've only directed one film, because your voice is exactly what this story needs," his agent said, "and because the studio is desperate to show they're on the right side of this whole Hampton situation." Andrew walked back to the table in a daze. His mama took one look at his face and asked, "What happened?" When he told her, she started crying right there in the fancy restaurant. "Look at God working," she said. "What they meant for bad turned for good." 2 weeks later, Andrew walked onto the biggest set of his career. Not as an actor this time, but as the director. Some crew members he recognized from Hampton's film years ago. They nodded at him with new respect in their eyes. "First day as director," one of them said. "How does it feel?" Andrew thought about everything that had happened: the rise, the fall, the rebuilding. "It feels like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The first scene was scheduled with the lead actor, a young talent whose story reminded Andrew a bit of his own. The young man seemed nervous, fumbling his lines during the first take. "That's great," Andrew said after calling cut. "Let's try it again, but remember, there's no perfect way to do this. I want to see your interpretation." The actor looked surprised. "You're not mad?" "This is a safe space to create," Andrew told him. "We're going to get there together." Later that day, Andrew called his mama during a break. "How's my director son doing?" she asked, the pride clear in her voice. "I keep waiting for someone to tell me I don't belong here," he admitted. "Baby, you fought for that chair," she said. "Nobody gave you anything. You earned it the hard way." As filming continued, industry publications covered the production closely. The headline in one major trade paper read, "Hollywood's most anticipated film finds its perfect director in industry critic." The final irony came when Andrew learned that Hampton had been denied funding for his next project, the first time in his decades-long career that studios weren't fighting to work with him. The power had shifted. On the last day of shooting, the entire cast and crew gathered for a group photo. As Andrew looked around at all the faces, diverse in every way, he felt a deep sense of completion. His journey had come full circle, but on his own terms. That night, he sat alone in his director's chair after everyone had left. The massive sound stage was quiet. He took out his phone and pulled up a photo from years ago, his first day on Hampton's set, young and hopeful, not knowing what was coming. "We made it," he whispered to his younger self. "Not the way we planned, but we made it." As he walked off the lot, security nodded at him. "Good night, director," the guard said. Director, a title no one could take away.